You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible. You have the fifth day of the murder trial of Derek Chauvin and wrapped up the first week of testimony, this time from Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman, the head of the Minneapolis Police Department's Homicide Unit. He condemned Chauvin's actions, saying they were uncalled for. Here's some of what he said today in court.
I received a phone call from Sergeant Kluger, who was the midwatch sergeant.
Do you recall what Sergeant Kluger, let me back up. Did Sergeant Kluger give you information that you relied upon to take further steps in your duties that night?
Yes.
Okay. What did Sergeant Kluger tell you?
Sergeant Kluger informed me that he was at the hospital at that time, and he was with a male that he described may or may not live. Later on in the night, I found out that that male was Mr. Floyd. He said he was down there at the hospital. He asked me if I would be willing to respond to the incident location of 38th in Chicago because he was tied up at the hospital at the time. He asked me if I would respond down there just to make sure, just in case we had to secure that area and make contact with any of his officers that were there on scene still, because this had the potential to be a possible critical incident.
Can you describe then what you mean by critical incident?
Usually an officer-involved incident where either the officer or somebody else has died, or an officer or somebody else has suffered great bodily harm that later led to death.
And based on your knowledge of Minneapolis Police Department policy, what is supposed to happen if there is a critical incident with the crime scene and with the participants?
A crime scene is supposed to be secured, which means locked down, and that is for the purpose to preserve any evidence that is there. The involved parties or the involved officers usually are chilling and awaiting escort sergeants so that they can be escorted to an interview room downtown. Appropriate notifications are made.
In all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
Did you watch that video in its entirety?
Yes, I did.
And since then, have you had an opportunity to watch other video of the incident?
Yes.
And specifically, have you watched body-worn camera video of the incident from the involved officers?
Yes.
And based on that and your years of training and experience with the Minneapolis Police Department, you saw then Officer Chauvin with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, correct?
Yes.
Would you call what you saw there a use of force?
Yes.
And did that use of force continue until the ambulance arrived?
Yes, it did.
Was there any change in the level of force being used until the ambulance arrived?
No.
And what do you think about that use of force during that time period?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about that use of force during that time period?
A little vague. Could you limit it to the time frame?
Right. Okay. So, based on your review of the body-worn camera videos of the incident,
Yes.
and directing your attention to that moment when Mr. Floyd is placed on the ground.
Yes.
What is your, your view of that use of force during that time period?
Totally unnecessary.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, pulling him down to the ground, face down, and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
New question.
So, in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?
Absolutely.
And I should add to that question then also that it appeared he had stopped resisting.
I'm sorry?
And it appeared that he had stopped putting up any resistance.
Absolutely, I would stop.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, folks, let's hear from attorneys Natalie Jackson and Monique Pressley, who joins us. And, of course, we still have our panel. I'll start with you, Monique. Your assessment of today's testimony in Day 5 of Derek Chauvin murder trial.
It was critical testimony because we are now getting to the point in the trial where they zone in on the law, on use of force, and how all use of force guidelines and protocols were violated. So it's going to be important that as we move on, that we hear from people who are on the force who know that in the same or similar situation, they would not have acted in that manner.
Natalie?
I 100% agree with Monique. This is the testimony that will prove up the murder 2 charge. In murder 2, they have to prove that not only did Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd, which is a causation issue, they also have to prove that he committed an assault and battery on George Floyd. That's what excessive force is. It means that you are using force that is illegal. Officers are allowed to use force to stop arrest. However, they can't use excessive force. So this lieutenant's testimony was critical in showing that Derek Chauvin used excessive force and thus committed a crime of assault and battery on George Floyd.
Monique, how critical is it to have a homicide detective, not somebody who's a former cop testifying for the prosecution, but an active duty police officer saying those words in front of a jury?
It's the closest we've gotten yet, as I said, to bearing down on the question that's before the jury. I agree with what Natalie said. And as I said yesterday, sure, there are lots of things that are happening that are emotional testimony that pull on the emotions, the feelings, the anger, the rage, the hurt of jurors. But at the end of the day, they're going to be instructed not to follow their emotions, but to lean on and hear the instructions of law, to apply the law, to evaluate the witnesses, and to make a determination of whether this officer utilized appropriate, necessary force. And we know for sure that he did not. There was one other thing that was important, though, when Sergeant Edwards was talking at the beginning of the day, giving testimony, and said that when he got on the scene, he followed protocol in asking the 2 involved officers to turn on their body cams. Now, what prosecution wasn't saying at that point, but I know they will say, is that those body cams never should have been off. If they were interacting with witnesses after Mr. Floyd's body, because Mr. Floyd was gone, after his body was loaded into the ambulance and taken to another location, if they spoke with witnesses, if they talked to each other while they were waiting in the cruiser, they should have had those cameras on because they had been involved in what could have been and actually was a crime scene. So the fact that he showed up, followed protocol, told them to put them back on and then have a seat meant that he fully had sized up what was going on that scene. And then obviously others came and took over for him. But that's missing evidence. That's destruction of potential evidence in time where we have no idea what those officers were doing or what they were saying until ultimately they were examined much later on and they were taken to another location.
But that also is powerful, Natalie, because again, by having these cops testify to that, it shows the kind of reckless behavior of the officers on the scene, and that
caused the death of George Floyd, whether or not that knee on his neck caused his death, and whether or not that death was a battery, which is murder 2, or whether or not he did it with a depraved heart, which is murder 3, or whether or not it was reckless indifference, which is manslaughter.
Candace Kelly, I want to bring you in your assessment of today's testimony.
Well, listen, this is really unprecedented. You don't often have cops taking the stand and talking poorly against other cops. We even heard from his supervisor talking about him being a subordinate and leaving out parts of the story, that part being that he left his knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So I think that this is huge. I think that this is something that jurors will look at and say, this isn't something that we see before. These people are turning on him, so to speak, and taking the stand. And then we also heard testimony that Derek Chauvin takes a continuing education class every year. And in this class, as we heard this homicide detective talk about today, they learn about this specific technique and not to do it, and the unreasonable force and what happens when it's used, that it causes death, and which is what he said on the stand right there. So, we see him vociferously taking notes, Derek Chauvin. I'm not sure why he was taking notes during that time, because he's been to that class every year and knew better, but he didn't do better. As the opening statement, the prosecution, and they said, he didn't let up, he didn't get up. He didn't let up, he didn't get up. And the prosecution has had an amazing week in proving that up till today when they let out midday.
Xavier?
Really great testimony that was there by Zimmerman, stating that once the threat level went down, then there should be some action being taken to make sure that the person is secure. Well, that didn't happen here. And it's pretty compelling to have police officers basically saying, hey, this is completely different than what's normally required on the scene to be able to secure an arrestee. So it's huge to show that they're excluding the activities of Derek Chauvin directly from what is acceptable. And you saw John Edwards, he was on the stand, and he seemed visibly shaken by what was going on, even though he did a good job of walking through his testimony. So a lot of the witnesses we've seen on the stand have been emotionally shaken. And I think that has a big impact on the jury.
Monique, final comments from you and Natalie. Would you say that for the prosecution, this was a very strong opening week?
Absolutely. They did their job this week, but this is, in my estimation, the easier part of the job, in that they control their witnesses. They have well prepped their witnesses. They have a strategy in place. They're executing that strategy. There weren't really any surprises. When we start the remainder of the case, and I don't know how much longer they'll be putting on their case. They say we're going to be going until the end of April, but at whatever point it turns over to the defense, that's going to get much more difficult, because the defense is going to try to switch defendants on us and make George Floyd the defendant. So the prosecution will have to be ready for that game plan. And the only other thing that I would say is, it's important for people to understand that we don't have to prove intent here. It doesn't matter whether Chauvin intended to kill George Floyd or not, whether it's second degree, third degree, or second degree manslaughter. It is only important to show that it was a contributing cause, that it was a superseding cause is not even necessary, but one of the causes. So when the defense is saying it was drugs, it could have been. When the defense is saying it was his heart, it could have been. But would it have happened but for the knee on the neck and all of the injury and restriction of blood flow and air that caused? So that's a much easier case to prove. And if everything is right in the world, the jury will reach the right decision.
Natalie?
I think that the prosecution had a great week. I think that they weaved in their theme throughout all the witnesses. In the opening statement, Jerry Blackwell promised that there would be a bouquet of humanity, and he put that on with the witnesses who were there trying to help George Floyd. He also said that in your care is in your custody is in your care. That was a part of his theme. didn't get up, didn't let up, as one of the other panelists said was a part of his theme. They are proving everything that they promised the jury in opening statement, and I think that they had a banner week this week.
Natalie Jackson, Monique Pressley, we surely appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
It's time to be smart. When we control our institutions, we win. This is the most important news show on television of any racial background. Y'all put $2, $3, $4, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30 on this and keep this going. What you've done, Roland, since this crisis came out in full bloom. Anybody watching this, tell your friends. Go back and look at the last 2 weeks, especially of Roland Martin Unfiltered. I mean, hell, go back and look at the last 2 days. You've had sitting United States senators today, Klobuchar and Harris. Whatever you have that you can bring to Roland Martin Unfiltered to support it, please do, because this information may literally save your life.
Watch Roland Martin Unfiltered daily at 6 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope, or go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered Daily Digital Show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.